Are there any other questions at present, or is everyone more or less ready?
Yeah, I'm fine, Anna.
Okay.
So we are going live now.
Eduardo, we can start now.
Right, thank you. Okay, welcome everybody. This is Eduardo Maced. I'm Deputy Director of CEDIL, the Center of Excellence, Development, Impact and Learning, and I'll be chairing this session today. So the seminar today is organized by CEDIL, together with 3IE and the Center for Evaluation at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And the speaker, we have two speakers today. I'll very soon give the floor to Francis Rathinam. He's an evaluation specialist at 3IE based in New Delhi, and he's the lead author of this study conducted by 3IE on using big data for evaluating development interventions. And we will also try to draw some lessons from the study on using big data in evaluating intervention in the time of the COVID pandemic. So we also have an additional speaker, is a co-author of the study, Javier Vollenweider. I'm not sure I'm spelling the name correctly. And he's a data scientist and development economist, and he's the co-author of the study, and will also present today and particularly address issues related to use of big data in relation to COVID. The study was funded by CEDIL, and CEDIL, as well as the study, are both funded by UK aid through the Department for International Development. So take also the opportunity to thank DFID and UK aid for supporting this work. And DFID also present today in the person of Federica Di Battista. Federica is evaluation advisor at DFID, and she's the lead of the trialing unit, the evaluation unit in DFID. She will be our discussant today. She will send some comments and some slides on Francis and Xavier's talk. So the structure of the talk is the following. There will be some 45 minutes for the presentation that will be shared between Francis and Xavier, and then there will be some 10 minutes more like, for Federica to present her discussion. Then maybe, depending on the time, there will be some time for Francis and Xavier to reply to Federica's comments, or otherwise we will open the floor to the audience for discussion. Now, when it comes to the discussion, we work in this way. I can see there are 137 participants, which is great. Of course, given the numbers, we're not going to be able to allow people to talk, to speak, and to intervene directly. So the way we're going to do this is the following. We invite you to write your questions in the Q&A box that you find at the center bottom of the screen. You can type your questions there. And we will monitor the questions, the ones that we can, either the authors or myself, we can reply, we'll do it directly. And I will select, depending on the number of the question, we'll select some of the questions, and I will pass them on at the end of the talk to Francis or Xavier. The final thing I need to say is that there have been cases of hacking of Zoom talks and events in the past, so I have to warn you, if that by any chance a similar accident had to happen, we will have to stop, and we'll resume the same talk shortly after. Okay, so that's for the introduction, and over to you, Francis. Francis, you're muted.
Yeah, thanks, Eduardo. Yeah, great. Thanks for joining us across other countries. I could see there are what, like 150 participants, and great to have you all. And well, like most of us are in like lockdown now, working from home, and most of the data collection activities for evaluations or development research in general is suspended. I guess there's no better time to share how big data can be used in impact evaluations without the need for going to the field to collect data. And sorry, I'm trying to move to the next page. Okay, so before I share what we found in the systematic map, I want to share the team. Generally, 3IE impact evaluations are a big team effort, systematically searching, collecting, coding, and analyzing big like databases require multiple skills and team like people. And so this team includes Shayok, Xavier, Manya, Pallavi from 3IE, and Samantha and Xavier from Flowminder. And before I share EGM, for some of us who are new to evidence gap maps, so this 3IE gap maps are kind of a systematic compilation of impact evaluations and systematic reviews in a sector or subsector or a question. So this map presents key evidence, the number of studies in a framework of interventions and outcomes. So the typical map would look something like this. Here, each the y-axis represents interventions, the x-axis outcomes, and each square would contain impact evaluations and systematic reviews that look at the corresponding interventions and the outcome. And the gray bubbles would represent impact evaluations and so different colors for systematic review depending on the confidence level. The size would represent the number of studies in that. And the purpose of gap maps are like now we know in the recent times the number of impact evaluations are steadily growing up, but these are all scattered across in various specialist organization databases, working paper series, and also in academic journals. So these EGMs aim to provide them all readily accessible to the policymakers in one place. And also it tries to highlight the key gaps like shown in the picture here. It tries to highlight the primary gaps where there are no studies and also areas where future systematic reviews would be useful. But EGMs typically do not synthesize or summarize the findings from the studies included. Its systematic reviews do that. And in EGMs, we also generally provide filters for country, study design, and population for analyzing further gaps in the literature. And this framework was developed by Marie Gardner and Birte Snelsworth, my colleagues at 3IE, over a series of papers. And this map, so the idea behind this map is the data gap in evaluating development outcomes is quite a bit. Typically, an impact evaluation would require data on various outcomes, intermediate, final outcomes, and also a series of covariates that have to be controlled in the analysis. And also we would need data on multiple pre-program, post-program periods. And generally we also would need a big sample size to look at subgroups and heterogeneity effects and so on. So the cost of collecting like multiple covariates, multiple pre-program, post-program data would generally limit the sample size and also power. In some cases, it could also limit what the impact evaluations could measure. And there are also a number of other challenges, like in some cases, the population of interest could be inaccessible, difficult to reach, or in cases like, say, epidemic and other crisis, it would be impossible to collect data. So in those cases, so this challenges would determine what is evaluated and what is not. In this context, big data could be quite useful for the reason that most of the big data is free or could be collected relatively cheaply. And also in most cases, the big data is available, it's always on, it's available for multiple periods, for massive number of groups or area. So the challenges related to the size of data, the multiple period, number of covariates, all could be taken care in specific cases in big data. We will see the details in the next few slides. So in this map, what we've done was we have mapped the studies that using different sources of big data onto development outcomes to see the current use case of big data, how big data has been used in impact evaluation, and also to see where there are gaps. We have included impact evaluations, systematic reviews, and a new type of study called, we are calling it measurement studies. These measurement studies are not necessarily impact evaluations using counterfactual based and establishing attribution. These studies show using various big data methods and big data sources how and development outcome could be measured. Like, for example, a study showing how agriculture productivity could be measured using satellite data. We would include that as a measurement study. And the primary purpose for including these measurement studies here is we see them as proof of concept for innovatively measuring and develop an outcome that could be used in the future impact evaluations. And overall, so the objective of the map is to show the use cases that existing impact evaluations and systematic reviews, and the potential unexplored applications through the measurement studies, and also the analytical ethical challenges that needs to be addressed in big data studies to ensure better internal and external validating. So methodology, we began by developing a protocol that defined the scope of work, the inclusion, exclusion criteria, the coding tools, and so on, with a series of consultation with the advisory group and like other practitioners. And we also did a literature search to see what are the analytical methodological challenges that big data studies face, and that could be addressed in the future studies, and also to explore how the existing studies have actually dealt with those. And then we did systematic search of various databases like Scopus and Social Sciences Citation Index, and also other specialist databases. And screening, data extraction, uprising of the studies were done based on the criteria defined in the protocol. And analysis and reporting explored the trends in the database and also the characteristics of the studies included. So the first inclusion criteria is the data source here. So based on UN Global Pulse and United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, we have decided to include three broad categories of big data. The first one is a human source information, which includes social networks like Facebook, Twitter, blogs, internet searches like Google Trends, mobile data content, and crowdsourced data, which is provided by the volunteers. And then the second broad category is the process mediated data, which is routinely and digitally collected by the public agencies like, say, tax authorities, or could be postal departments, and then by businesses like, say, e-commerce like Amazon's, and credit card transaction details, and so on. And then cell phone call records, this cell phone metadata that records who made the call, from where, the origin of the call, and the ending of the call, and so on. Those details were also included in the process mediated data. The third big category is the machine generated data, which includes satellites and various mobile and fixed sensors like pollution sensors and traffic sensors, and so on. For the outcomes, we have used sustainable development goals as the basis, but we have regrouped them into 10 thematic areas. For example, goal 1 and 8 have been clubbed into a group called economic development and livelihoods. So we searched the bibliographic databases and specialist hand search specialist databases. At the end of our initial search, we identified about 17,000 odd studies. And after screening out the obvious duplicates, the final list was about 9,720. That was screened at the title and abstract level. And the final list of 1348 studies were screened at the full text level by 4 research associates. And at this level, the associates have actually applied all the inclusion and exclusion criteria defined in the protocol. And the studies were excluded based on the data sources and outcomes which were not defined in the protocol. And also study design. Most of the studies which were excluded based on study design were primarily either policy papers or computer science like papers that developed algorithms rather than showing how a development outcome could be measured. In the end, the final list had 437 studies, of which 48 were impact evaluations, 381 were measurement studies, and 8 were systematic reviews. So here is the map, and in the chat, we will share the link to the map. Here in the y-axis, the horizontal axis, we have data sources. And then in the horizontal axis, we have outcome, the development themes. And the blue bubbles here represent measurement studies. The gray one represent the impact evaluations, and green and different shades of red for systematic reviews, depending on the level of confidence. And if you hover over any of the bubbles, you will get a pop-up window that shows the number of studies there. And you could click on the studies that would take you to the database, and also the actual studies if that's available. And also in the map, you could see on the top the filters. You could filter for the regions or countries, or even challenging context. In the fragile context, if you click, you could see among several options epidemics as well. Like, say, if you filter for epidemics, then you would see the studies that have been conducted in the context of epidemics, and how various data sources have been used to study epidemics, what that submap would actually show. And also we have provided submaps for outcomes where there are a good number of entries. Like, for example, if you hover over the economic development and livelihoods, the first outcome, that will take you to a pop-up window, and to another submap behind this map, where the same data sources have been coded against tier 2 SDD indicators. The tier 2 indicators for economic development, and also for employment, the goal 1 and goal 8. So we will see the trends and characteristics of the included studies in the next slides. So this graph, this picture provides an overview of the maps. This Sankey diagram is generally used for showing flow data, and also the relationship between like various components of data in a many-to-many mapping context. Here we see the relationship between the type of study that's in the beginning, and then the type of big data source and the outcome here. And the size of flow represents the number of studies here. So navy blue represents the human source data, and the grayish pink color represents process mediated data, and the light blue represents machine generated data. If you look at the top corner of the figure, we see impact evaluations. You could see that most of the impact evaluations use machine generated satellite data, and we see there's very little like in terms of other sources being used in impact evaluation. When it comes to measurement studies, we could see all the 3 major sources are being used reasonably well, but still the satellite data, the machine generated data contributes to the maximum. And in terms of outcomes, the bottom corner, you could see the environmental outcomes. That's actually the most studied outcome, followed by economic development, health, and urban development. And this map shows the geographical distribution of the studies. We could see the maximum number of studies come from Asia. About 50% of the studies come from Asia, with a good number for India and China. In Africa, the East Africa is very well represented, but the rest of Africa is not, especially for several countries in West Africa. We don't have any entry at all. And you could see from the map that we also have included studies from developed countries. Typically, EGMs look at LMICs, but here the rationale behind including developed countries is to get use cases from developed countries as well, which could be replicated or adapted to the LMIC context. Like, for example, there were interesting studies in Estonia that have used mobile data to assess tourism, or like in the US, there are studies on epidemics, influenza epidemics, or in the UK, the studies using web searches to see a crime rate and also like the crime hotspots that could be adapted to other contexts as well. And we could in the map shows that there are about 1/4 of the studies that come from developed countries, the remaining are from LMICs. And the next, one of the key characteristics of this map is the unit of observation. Typically, a unit of observation in an impact evaluation is the level at which the program is implemented, and also the level at which the impact is expected. Like, for example, in a cash transfer program, the program is implemented at the level of household, and the impact would be expected at the individual level, say, for example, child level, or at the household level. But on the contrary, a watershed program, the impact would be expected at the level of catchment area versus non-catchment area, which could coincide with an administrative classification like village or sub-counties and so on. So we have clubbed all the area level like units into administrative unit classification, and then household and population into household and individual into population as a unit of observation. We could see that most of the studies in the map have both in terms of measurement studies and as well as impact evaluations have used administrative unit as a key unit of observation. But if you look at the data sources, the picture is slightly different. Mostly for the machine generated data, satellite data, and so on, the primary unit is administrative like unit. But for human source data and process mediated data, the primary unit is population. And to show how big data could be used in the fragile context, we are using fragile states index provided by the Funds for Peace. So this is a heat map from the index. The index consists of like multiple social, economic, political like criteria, and blue represents a sustainable like states, the green more stable, and different shades of orange for different level of like warning, and red for alert and high alert. And we have juxtaposed the number of studies from our map onto this heat map of fragile states index, and we could see that a really good number of studies come from the studies which are classified as like a warning or like a heightened warning level. And we could also see a good number of studies in the high alert categories as well. So in the report, we also have provided classifications for OECD that provides data at the level that defines fragility on the basis of like war and epidemics as well. So using big data in the context of epidemics, Xavier will talk about some of the use cases of how big data can be used in epidemics to measure population movement and disease spread and so on. Here, I briefly highlight what we find from this map. We have a submap for health outcome, and that submap is coded against tier 2 indicators for health, the SDG goal 3 on health, for like say mortality, reducing ending epidemics, and so on. And we could see that there are about 25 studies in the map that's been conducted in the context of epidemics. And one key gap that we identify here is almost all the studies are measurement studies. We don't see any impact evaluation in the context of epidemics in the map. And when we look at the data sources that are being used in the context of epidemics, you could see that the cell phone call records, the CDR data, is the maximum used, and followed by internet searches, social networks, and a couple of studies, a few studies in using data from satellites and sensors as well. The data quality and ethical challenges. we have identified a list of data quality and ethical challenges that need to be addressed, especially in the big data context that would otherwise threaten the internal and external validity. Like, for example, say the representativeness of data. If the population of interest is the poorest of the poor, and if CDR data from a country where internet penetration or like mobile phone penetration is at the 80% level, and if our interest population of interest is poorest of the poor, then it might be the case that the people of interest might be left out from the sample that we have. So so the representativeness of data is really important to understand whether that source of data can be used for evaluation or not. But then this would actually differ for different source of big data. Again, like say satellite data really do not have a representativeness issue, because that's available for pretty much every part of the world. So we have listed key issues like, say, construct validity, data quality issues like completeness, comparability over time, representativeness of data, generalizability of findings, and so on. And then appraisal studies, the impact evaluations and measurement studies, and how they've dealt with these issues. We could see that there are about 95 studies have dealt with at least one of these data quality or transparency issues. But one of the key highlights from the map is the impact evaluations have done much better in terms of reporting on data quality and transparency across all categories. This could be that impact evaluations have evolved, and the reporting on data quality and the challenges is quite well developed. But measurement studies aim to use a new algorithm or show new ways of measuring an outcome. But reporting on data quality and transparency is not one of the key defining characteristics of measurement studies at present. And so we could see that there's a lot of potential for cross learning, like from impact evaluations to like measurement studies on reporting data quality and transparency. And in terms of like ethical issues, we looked at whether the studies have obtained ethical approval, consent for using the data, whether they have looked at data privacy issues, data security issues, and so on. But see, again, most of the studies have not discussed ethical issues at all, including impact evaluations. So this actually it's an important gap, and in the report we call for more a big data specific ethical ethical approval like standards. So the key findings in terms of evidence base and gaps, we could see that the map shows there are considerable potential for measuring various development outcomes that we could see from the number of measurement studies in the map. And also there is potential for more impact evaluations, given that there are more measurement studies than impact evaluations. So these measurement studies could be used in the future impact evaluations. And satellite data is the most used data, and especially in the context where the interventions and key outcomes have some spatial dimension. CRD data and human source data have reasonable good proof of concepts across development outcomes, but they have not been used in impact evaluation much. And East Africa is very well represented, but not rest of Africa in terms of geographical coverage. And then big data also holds a great potential for conducting measurement studies and impact evaluations in the fragile context. In terms of data quality and ethical issues, this is a major gap in the literature. A few studies report on reporting like quality and transparency issues, and also ethical standards are not very well defined, and studies do not report on ethical approval and so on. And another key gap that we see is the information on cost of collecting, analyzing big data is largely like unknown. We don't get any information on how much does it cost to collect this data. Some of these data sources, like say satellite data, could be free, but other data are proprietary and would actually come from data philanthropy and also establishing a long-term relationship. We also don't know the infrastructure cost of setting up big data analytical capacity. But from some other 3I funded studies, we could see that the cost of collecting big data is minimal, but the money that's spent on analyzing this data and reporting is as much as any other typical impact evaluation of the similar size. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Francis. Before giving passing this to Xavier, I was wondering whether you can just answer quickly a few questions related to the map that came up. It's very quick, so it's very easy questions, so you can very quick answer, please. Sure. So the first is, did you cover all SDGs in your map? And what level of disaggregation?
Yes, all the 17 SDGs are covered and been classified into one or other groups. And for the main map, we have classified, we have coded them at that level of 10 outcomes. But for the sub maps, some of the sub maps, like for example, a sub map for health is being coded at tier 2 level. Say sub map for economic development and livelihood is being coded at tier 2 level. The level at group, say goal 1 and goal 2 level. But for say subgroup for environmental sustainability, which includes goal 12, 13, 14, and 15, is coded at level 1 in the subgroup, in the submap.
Okay, thanks. You can answer this very quickly because it's a quick answer to this. How many languages do you use? You look at English only, or also other languages like Chinese and some others?
Yeah, this is English only. That's an important constraint.
Yeah. How do you define high confidence and low confidence studies? What was the criteria for? So
in the map, the link that we have provided, we could actually see that the bottom of the map, there is a link provided by 3IE, like risk of bias assessment for impact evaluations. So we have applied that framework to assess the risk for each, the risk of bias for each systematic review.
Okay, can you define quickly what is a measurement study?
Okay, so these are not impact evaluations in the sense that they don't use counterfactual based, and they don't establish like a causation, but their primary aim is to show how a variable could be measured. Like the example that I gave, if the aim is to measure agriculture productivity at the plot level using satellite data, but not in the context of an impact evaluation of how productivity has changed due to an intervention, but the study just shows that using one say data point to show that plot level, this is the productivity. So the idea for using this measurement studies is to that this way of measuring agriculture productivity or any other development outcome could be used in impact evaluation.
Okay, thank you. Very clear. I think we can move to the second part of the presentation, where Javier will speak about how big data could potentially be used in evaluating or understanding issues related to COVID. So it's over to you, Javier.
Excellent. Hi, everyone. Do you see my screen? Do you see the presentation clearly?
We can see you, but not your screen.
Oh. Is it coming? Is it there?
Yeah, it's now on. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much. So, I'm going to present you a bit of what we do at Flowminder Foundation. I'm Xavier Vollenweider, Senior Associate at the Foundation. And the aim is to introduce you to the use of mobile data, and particularly in the context of the COVID response. So about us, Flowminder Foundation is a non-profit organization. Our aim is to support decision maker in their work at transforming the life of vulnerable people at scale. We support mobile network operator and government to use this big data source to produce insights for decision making. We have pioneered the use of mobile network data to support response to infectious disease outbreak, notably in the aftermath of the Haiti earthquake and the subsequent cholera outbreak in 2010, and using this big data source in natural disaster. We are funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, DFID, Dial, Hewlett Foundation, and many other. So a quick introduction to call detail record, CDR. So what are they? So imagine that a subscriber of a given mobile network operator wake up in the morning, make a call. This call is going to be routed through the nearest tower, cell tower, and is going to be stored on the network operator database. In the database, for billing purposes, there are two key information which are going to be recorded: the time of the call and the cell tower through which the call was made. Then the subscriber goes to work, and at 2 p.m., say, he makes a second call. And again, we're going to get the cell tower through which the call was channeled and the timestamp of this call. So what it shows and what it says, this graph, is that we get information only when a subscriber make a call, send a text, or start a data session. So it's not like the GPS data collected by Google or other smartphone app, which are pretty much almost continuous. Here, it's only when there is an interaction on the mobile network operator network. So benefit of using CDRs, the call detail record. First, they are automatically generated. There is a continuous stream of data. It's near real time. It's mechanically collected, so it's purely factual. There is no interview bias. It consists of billions of data points from millions of people. So there's large geographic and time scales covered. And it has better population representativeness, particularly in low and middle income country, than other data that could be obtained via smartphone apps because of the lower penetration of smartphone in low and middle income country context. So utilizing mobility data in the COVID-19 context, we have identified at the Flowminder five main use cases. First is to look at the primary effect of the measure adopted by the government to contain the spread of COVID-19. And here I'm talking about primary effect on the mobility of people, not on the disease spread, really on mobility of people. Second use case is the side effect of COVID-19 measure. So it has been observed, for instance, in developed country context like Paris or New York, that as soon as lockdown was announced, there would be a spread of the urban population in the rural part of the country. So that's one possible side effect. Another possible side effect that everyone has in mind, naturally, is the economic consequence of the government measure against COVID-19. So first effect, first use case, primary effect. Second use case, side effect. Third use case for mobile data in the COVID-19 context is identifying routine mobility patterns to plan intervention and assess risk level. Fourth use case is change in population density. Because of the government measure, people location and the distribution of the population across the territory might have changed, and hence having a better understanding of where the people are during these times might help in allocating resource more effectively across the territory. And then naturally, the last use case is to use this mobility data as an input to other models, such as disease spread models. So in terms of data quality, although at first we might think that mobile network operator data are going to be super clean, it's not always the case. There's always a bit of work and quite a lot of time to be done on the data themselves. Some data might be missing for some time period. There might be some corrupted records. There might be some error in the location of the cell towers, which is going to affect how you measure mobility. And then there's like important issues on the analysis side that needs to be considered. First, the spatial resolution of this information. As said before, there is a record only when the people make a call channel via a cell tower. What does it mean? It means that your spatial resolution is going to depend on the distribution of this cell tower across the territory. So in urban settings where you have quite a lot of cell tower, the resolution, the spatial resolution is going to be good. In a rural setting, however, you might have just one tower covering 20 kilometers. The temporal resolution is also an issue because of as we have information only when people make a call, send the SMS or start a data session, there is some people who are not going to have a lot of interaction on the network, and hence it's going to be hard to have information about their location across time. And then naturally, there is the representativeness of the data. So not everyone use a mobile phone. There is clear group of the population which tend to have a lower probability to have mobile phone, SIM cards, such as the children, the elderly, women, and the most vulnerable. We tend to have only data from one mobile network operator. That's pretty rare to have access to data from multiple mobile network operator, and hence the geographic coverage of your data is going to depend completely on the market share of each mobile network operator. And then the population that you are going to cover is going to depend on the segment of the subscriber that the mobile network operator you are working with is able to reach. Some mobile network operator are kind of the high end, and other are rather like a cheap solution. So again, it's going to introduce some bias. And naturally, there's the issue of the fact that one SIM card, so the record that you're going to have, doesn't always correspond to one person. You can have one SIM card, which is going to be shared within the family by multiple people, and each person might have multiple SIM cards. So it might be quite tricky to get a good result out of this type of data. Our approach at Flowminder, first, big emphasis on privacy and data governance. These are really sensitive data, and Flowminder, when it does access individual level CDR data, access only pseudonymized data. That is, we don't have the phone number or the name of each mobile network operator subscriber. We just have a hashed misdem, an identifier that is hashed and that cannot be linked to a particular person. We, in terms of release, we release only aggregated and anonymized statistic. Say, for instance, the count of people in a given area. No individual level data ever leaves the country where we are operating. So that's really like strong position that we have. Which limits typically the use of cloud-based solution if the server behind the cloud is not hosted and stored in country. No individual level data leaves the control of the mobile network operator. It means that when we do access individual level data, we have a server which is installed behind the firewall of the mobile network operator, and the mobile network operator control our access to this data and control the type of analysis that we do and control any output that we would go out. Needs to be GDPR compliant, meaning that the mobile network operator has this data controller role, and that Flowminder, we are only the data processor. And last principle is that we release all our code openly so that it can be peer reviewed, and it's really an important aspect for building trust. So what is the Flowminder strategy to support the COVID-19 response? So we focus on low and middle income country, and we have decided to have this three-pillar approach. The first pillar is to provide publicly available instruction, code, and material. So there is a web page with guidance on how to use mobile network operator data to support the COVID response. There is also a GitHub repository open with all the SQL queries that we recommend to use in a developing country or low-income country context. And so this is really like open. Any mobile network operators or anyone having access to mobile network operator data willing to support the COVID response can access this resource. Then we have the second pillar, which is providing remote support to a mobile network operator to produce the statistic required by the response of their respective government. Under the second pillar, Flowminder does not access CDR data. It only helps and supports the technical staff at the mobile network operator in using the code that we provide. So it's just like a series of meetings and sessions to support them and guide them in the process of producing this aggregate and then disaggregated statistic and then producing reports based on this aggregated statistic for the benefit of the task force against COVID-19 of each country. And then the third pillar is providing in-depth and hands-on analytical support for more bespoke analysis, where we do have already a long-term agreement with a mobile network operator pre-existing COVID-19 and which allow us to access CDR data. So really like the main difference is that under the pillar 2, Flowminder does not touch the CDR data. The main advantage, and when I say doesn't touch the CDR data, it doesn't touch the individual level CDR data. The main advantage here is that the legal documentation that needs to be put together is much slimmer compared to a real agreement for long-term cooperation with a mobile network operator. So this is
Xavier, could you please wrap up because we have a few minutes left, please. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. Let me go through then this just to give you a sense of the type of insight that we can get from this data. These are the findings from a report published with our partner Vodacom DRC, where we did at the request of the task force of the government of DRC, the impact of its measure against COVID. So what do we see is we have used Vodacom data in partnership with Vodacom technical team to look at the impact of the lockdown on the subscriber presence in La Gombe, the main business district. And we see that there have been like a large drop over time linked to this measure. This is also observed at the airport where all the flights were banned. We see that there is also a redistribution of the subscriber across Kinshasa. And here you see that La Gombe, the business district, is affected by minus 65% drop. And then the surrounding municipality are also, there's also a drop in subscriber presence. The periphery no change, and this can naturally be used for health resource allocation across the Kinshasa province, as well as provide an indication of the economic impact of the measure, given the fact that as there are less people in the streets, there is less economic activity. This is decrease in outflow from Gombe, this business district, so movement trips out of Gombe. And again, there is like a large decrease linked to the government measure, and can be used to monitor the effect of the measure on population movement, get a sense of the side effect, because these people moving not out of Gombe are the same that are not moving in Gombe. That is, there are less commuter, so less people able to come to La Gombe to get a living. And hence, there might be a large economic effect. And naturally, this can be used also to in this spread modeling to get a sense of area, particular at risk of new cases. And last slide is this decrease in expenses on mobile recharge. So this is how much people spend on their mobile phone. What is interesting in this graph is the large spike on March 27, which was the day followed up the announcement of the lockdown of Gombe. There was like a panic purchase in the streets of essential goods, and also of recharge on mobile phone, as shown on this graph. The lockdown was finally postponed amidst fear of price increases. And when it was finally imposed on the 6th of April, there have been a large drop in La Gombe, the blue line, which pretty much corresponds to less subscriber coming into La Gombe, the business district, but also in Kinshasa at large, which is probably indicating the economic slowdown of Kinshasa. Going to skip this, and that's it for now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Maybe before we move to Federica, if you can just answer quickly a couple of questions that came up, one for Xavier, one from Francis. Question for Javier is whether can you only track mobile data, or can you also look at text messages and WhatsApp messages? And the other question for probably for Francis is what kind of, particularly talking about COVID, what kind of health outcomes can you actually observe using satellite data? If you can give an example of that.
Quick answer on the type of data that we use. It's indeed calls, SMS, and data session. For the data session, it's at the start of the data session. So when you start consuming data, that's where we have an entry. And just highlighting the fact that the data are pseudonymized, and that Flowminder does not engage into individual level tracking. We only look at population movement.
Okay, thank you. Satellite, yeah.
So using satellite data to measure health outcomes is rare. In the map that we have actually shown that there are about only 5 studies, and in most cases that the satellite data has been used in combination with CRD data. Like similar to CRD data, satellite data can also be used in identifying population movement using night light. So that was used. So satellite data is used to identify the population movement during like epidemic, like for example in Cote d'Ivoire, and also Flowminder has done a study in Bangladesh where they've used a combination of CRD and satellite data to measure population movement. Population movement is actually the key outcome that's been like, key outcome.
Yeah, thank you. That's clear. Okay, thank you for presentation, and we will now hear from some comments from Federica. So Federica, please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Eduardo, and thank you, Francis and Xavier, for the brilliant presentation. I'm very happy to start the discussion around the paper I generally enjoyed the reading, and I think that disseminating and discussing the results and findings of the paper is extremely relevant and timely, considering that challenges that the COVID situation is posing for international development generally, but specifically for all of us involved in commissioning or managing impact evaluation studies. I suppose my first very brief reflection, since one of our participants has already highlighted the point, is a very short reflection around whether the fact that the authors have used English as their only language for searching studies might be a potential source of bias, particularly around areas like the results and the descriptive statistics and distribution that you showed us about the geography, or the fact that most of the studies that the paper reviews are peer-reviewed journal publication, or even maybe the type of big data used. So I suppose that I would, time permitting, I would really like to hear from the authors whether they think we might be missing something or some big trend coming from the non-English speaking world, for example, Latin America or French-speaking West Africa. A further reflection is around satellite data and fixed sensors. I was very struck by the fact that most of the studies, used this particular big data technology to collect data. I find it very interesting, and my immediate reaction was, why is that the case? Why satellite and why satellite and fixed sensors? And the first two ideas that came into my mind, and I'm of course happy to hear whether the authors or the broader audience think that there are more. But the first two ideas that came up in my mind were representativeness and, again, related to the language. As Francis said, the big advantage of satellite is that they are representative more than the other technologies for big data. So if we consider also the fact that, so if we combine this fact with the fact that most of the studies that the paper reviews seem to come from studies in peer-reviewed journals, is there some, let's say, is there some cyclical relation between representativeness, and so the use of satellite data, and peer review, and the fact that the studies are in peer-reviewed journals? So is the system, I'm wondering whether the system around using big data for impact evaluation specifically is implicitly somehow incentivizing very representative studies, and hence the use of this particular kind of technology for big data. And the second is, again, connected a little bit to the point that I was making above, which is that I've never used, for example, social media data, but I would guess that it requires a little bit of at least basic understanding of the local language, while maybe the satellite and the fixed sensor speaks more of a international language, if we want. And so I would generally welcome any additional reflections on these or other possible motivations around why satellite seems to be so popular, especially among the practitioners or researchers that are oriented towards peer-reviewed journal publication. An additional point of discussion is probably around future trends. I could think about at least probably two key trends that might impact in the short or in the medium long term how much and how big data are used both in measurement studies and impact evaluation. The first is, not surprisingly, COVID. So as the authors have very correctly pointed out, COVID is at this stage is dramatically limiting our possibilities of conducting impact evaluation studies and measurement studies in the more traditional sense, so with face-to-face interviews. So big data can, as much as many studies are switching to, for example, remote surveying, like phone surveying, big data can be a valuable alternative to collect data in a universe where we cannot meet with the respondents. And the second big trend is around technology penetration. I think all the data points to the fact that technology is becoming more and more available. More and more people have access to a mobile phone. As Xavier was mentioning, it's absolutely true that it's not spreading evenly. So there are still certain strata of the population that are marginalized from and are left out a little bit from this technology penetration process. But overall, we can say that a mobile phone will increasingly be available to an increasing number of people around the world. So what does these two trends, isolated or in combination, mean in terms of the quantity of studies that we can expect in the coming months and years that use big data? And what does it mean in terms of, or what might mean in future in terms of the diversification that we might observe in terms of the type of technology used, the thematic area that the big data are getting applied to, but even capacity building and expertise availability around collection, manipulation, and analysis of this type of data. One last reflection before I jump into my personal policy takeaway from the paper and the presentation. This is a little bit leveraging on a little bit of my personal experience. In my personal life, I was managing a portfolio of impact evaluation, mostly dealing with agricultural and rural development. And I think that anybody who's participating that has ever had to deal with an agricultural survey knows how incredibly resource and time consuming exercise that can be if you want to be very comprehensive in terms of the information you want to collect. So I can remember observing with extreme interest to the rise in popularity of satellite and other sources of big data to really make impact evaluations in agricultural and rural development more approachable, better value for money. So I totally agree on the author's conclusions around the fact that there is a clear, strong opportunity for big data in areas where there's a rich problem, like fragile and conflict afflicted states. But I'm wondering whether it might be of interest to explore also what the opportunities might be around using big data in areas where maybe reach is not necessarily a big constraint, but can dramatically reduce the time and cost of data collection and impact evaluations. And I'm wondering whether this might be one of the coming steps, especially since you highlighted that there's still a little bit of uncertainty around costs. Very last slides from me is about my personal policy takeaway messages that I'm definitely going to take home and reflect on and act upon. The first is on the need for ethical standards and policies. I think that the paper stressed this point very well, the presentations did too. I think that big data have been used now for some time in measurement and impact evaluation studies. But we know that some of the standard, if we want to call it like that, ethical principle are just difficult to apply, or it's not very clear how to apply them in a big data context. And wherever there's a little bit of gray area around the ethical standards, it creates some nervousness from international development organizations, especially those that have a very, we all have a very low appetite towards safeguarding risks. And I think that it's really time to come together and start working and start establishing some good ethical standards and policies that can reduce that nervousness, and relax the constraints that might derive from it. Second takeaway message for me is definitely around capacity building and coordination. I think that the international development community really needs to become intelligent commissioner and user of studying using big data. And this means that we need to, let's just say, to enable for this these experience and capabilities to spill a little bit over from the traditional niches and silos where it's currently stored, so that we have at least a basic level of understanding and literacy around this data. Because I think that if we don't know what is the potential and how we should use it and how we should not use it, we will always fail to capture the opportunities that this incredibly rich source of data can give us. And I think this is all for my reflection. I'll pass the floor back to you, Eduardo.
Thank you, Federica. Very interesting comments. So I suggest that I would suggest that Francis, maybe you would like to comment on at least initially to what Federica was saying about the expansion of the potential expansion of the use of big data in the future in impact evaluation, and so whether that will be encouraged by COVID and by the diffusion of technology in this area. In the meantime, I'd like to maybe, Xavier, you can think about another question that came not from Federica, but from the audience, is whether you can make an example of a policy change that was produced by some data analysis conducted by Flowminder in relation to COVID specifically. Yeah, it's a COVID response. Yeah.
Thanks, Eduardo,
Yeah,
and thanks, Federica, for an excellent review and a number of very interesting questions. So related to the use of satellite data and the future of IEs, what I see is first of all, the number of studies using satellite data are primarily in the developing country context, but a good number of them have been done by academics who are based in the global north. But one contradictory trend that we could also see is a good number of studies from India and China are done by the researchers who are based in their respective countries. So there is some bit of diffusion of this the expertise in some of the LMICs to begin with. Number two, there is also an increasing availability of pre-processed satellite data. Like, so for example, say AData's GeoQuery provides satellite data on several development outcomes for multiple level of aggregation, like at the national level or at the subnational level or at the county or sub-district level, and for multiple years, in some cases beginning from early 2000s. So those pre-processed data could be used in impact evaluations straight away. So that would enhance the use of satellite data. But depending on the questions, say if the evaluation question would require the satellite data, satellite images to be processed by the researchers, that is where the constraint would be. And one of the key issues that you highlighted, the donors' role in promoting more collaboration between evaluators and remote sensing scientists and big data analysts who assess, who use various, say, human-generated data or CRD data. So those collaboration would be extremely valuable in ensuring that the local contextual knowledge is also that informs the future measurement studies and impact evaluations. So in terms of future IEs, there are also a couple of questions in the Q&A section. So how I see this this evolving given COVID. I would expect, given from what we see in the map, there would be more and more quasi-experimental studies. So from the list of impact evaluations that we see, most of them are quasi-experiment using satellite data, and especially when the interventions have some kind of spatial dimension, like, for example, impact of a program at the local area level, or impact of an infrastructure program, or impact of a watershed program, and so on, or even the studies that using a CRD data that could be aggregated at the level of, say, cell tower and so on. There is where I see the new impact evaluations like coming in. And also that's like related to another question in the Q&A that that how exactly a counterfactual could be established. Just to give an example from some of the existing studies, if it's an infrastructure program, the intervention area would be decided as the areas which are adjacent to the program placement. That's the infrastructure, for example, the road. So maybe the 2 kilometer on either side of the road, or 5 kilometer either side of the road, could be considered as the intervention area. And the areas which are far away from that, which are less likely to benefit from the road, could be considered as the control group. And since the data is available for most cases from 1993, that would include pre-program, several years of pre-program data and post-program data. That could be used in a quasi-experimental, like in a difference like study. But then this might look say 2 kilometers around or 5 kilometers around the intervention might look arbitrary. But since the data is available at a very granular level, in the sense that like any say 1 kilometer 1 by 1 kilometer parcel that the data is available, we will be able to construct several control groups or counterfactuals for sensitivity analysis as well. So that's how impact evaluations are done using big data. And also, I want to quickly touch upon the question on using only English. That's a very important point. I agree that including only English, like studies written in English, would bias the geographical classification, and also the number of studies in terms of different source of big data. The issue here is data that's coming from satellites, the sensors, are also data that coming from CRD or say the government like service providers or private sector service providers, like say e-commerce and so on. Those are language free, but especially the one that's coming from internet searches and social media, there the impact of excluding Spanish or French or any other like a major language would have huge implication of the number of studies, the issues considered, like and so on. So that's a key gap, and like I would recommend that future like gap maps should include that, and that would also require a much larger team with that kind of skill set.
If I may just add on this, yeah, in terms of the use of CDR data, so the mobile network operator data, one of the big limiting factors for the research and the publication is the access to this data. It's really hard. I mean, managing to gain access to a data to data from a mobile network operator can take up to 3 years of negotiation. Sometimes it's much faster, but sometimes it's very long. Coming back to your question, Eduardo, from an impact that Flowminder would have had during the pandemics, thanks to these analytics. To be frank, we have not had the time to set up a proper evaluation framework of our own activity, and it's always hard to attribute a decision to one report that we would have published. There are many other reasons for a policymaker to decide something. However, in one of the countries where we are operating, that I'm not feeling very comfortable to cite openly, there has been a relaxation of the lockdown in the capital city, slight relaxation where they have allowed worker from kind of registered businesses and administration. So those who are like officially employed and able to prove that they're employed to come back to the central business district. And this might have been, this decision might have been influenced by the finding of our report, where we did show that commuters were likely to be adversely impacted and that there was likely a strong adverse economic impact. But I would not feel confident first to state which country it was, and second to claim that it was only us. We are probably just like one of the supporting evidence in the decision-making process.
Yes, of course. We are coming to a close. Maybe just a final question for Francis, based on Federica's comments, but also comments coming from the audience. Maybe you can say something about how how to frame this is this issue of how representative is the gap map of the research, and how that relates to publication bias. So, for example, people asking what kind of why there's only few studies from fragile states. Why? So is because there is no evidence there, or why there is so much satellite data? Is because academic journals requires such and such for publication and so on. So can you say something about the representative selection bias in the production of the gap map or the evidence?
Well, so EGMs are more of a snapshot. So I won't be able to say like why exactly we observe what we observe. But like from the reading, what I could see is, first of all, more peer-reviewed studies and less gray literature. That one reason could be, see, the academic databases are like searchable, but some of this gray literature archives like archives are not searchable. And we could have missed out on some of these databases. We did search manually in these databases, but since they are not searchable using strings, we might have missed some of the gray literature. So that could be an area. So improvement in searching in those gray literature would lead to like a better composition of peer-reviewed and gray literature. That's like number one. And so what was the second question?
No, it was just about if you have any reflection on how the evidence on the process of how evidence is generated. Given different constraints, states, so fragile states, well, and or publications requirements and like.
Yeah. So on the fragile states, I would actually consider, so given that there were 1/4 of the studies from fragile context, there is good representation. But then we really don't have any a priority like a proportion that would come from fragile states, right? So there is no basis to expect that a particular proportion would come from fragile states in a scenario where there is no bias. So there is no baseline to compare to answer that. But I see there is a good number of impact evaluations and measurement studies in the fragile context, and that shows the potential for like more future studies. And in terms of satellite data, I actually see satellite data is more conducive for quasi-experimental studies that would readily fit into some of the evaluation questions that are using face-to-face survey data difficult to answer. Like, for example, if you look at 3IE impact evaluation database, the most number of studies actually come from health, education, social protection, and the least number would come from say infrastructure, and so on, or like infrastructure, local like area, like a development, agriculture productivity, and that's where exactly this big data or satellite database studies can answer. So I see wherever there is the spatial dimension, satellite data is more conducive to be applied. Again, there is another question around like how we can use CRD data in impact evaluations. There is no use case at all. So we really don't know how that would actually come from. One potential like possibility is like CRD data aggregated at the cell phone tower level could be a possibility which could be used exactly how satellite data is used in a geospatial impact evaluation. But there are no clear use cases for other sources like other than satellite data.
Okay, thank you, Francis. And we now have to close. So let me thank Francis and Javier for their nice presentation. Thank you, Federica, for your very interesting comments, and thank to DFID for supporting this work. We probably were not able to answer all the questions, and but we will keep a record of the questions that came up in the question and answers and the chat box. I don't think people will be able to reply to those questions unless there are some email address. I don't think that's possible, but it will certainly be useful to the authors for revising their papers and to improve to clarify their presentations. Okay, thank you everybody for attending. Just let me remind you that next week there will be another talk, and Richard Manning and Ian Goldman will present a paper on how an evaluation of impact evaluation. So it's would be a very interesting talk next week at the same time on the same day. So I hope to see many of you again next week. Okay, thank you all for attending and for presenting.